Well, let's move on to WikiLeaks for a second here, Webster.
Yeah, and it's a good place to bring it in. If you look at Zbigniew Brzezinski, he's written these books, and he says, again, there are about 200 million kids in the Arab world, or the third world in general, underdeveloped countries, and the Arab world is a big part of it. And they don't like their governments, but they don't like the Islamic opposition, and therefore we can make a harvest of dupes like you wouldn't believe. What we need to do is to capture the imagination of these young nihilists, right? People who really believe in nothing. They're not Islamic. They're not Marxist. They're not, classical liberal. They're not Nasser. They're really nothing. They just think Google and Twitter are cool. So you create an anti-hero for them, and this is Assange. Now, the basic idea of this is we have Cass Sunstein, who is now a czar in the Obama White House. He's the regulation czar. He has a whole track record of horrible decisions in this regard. But the first time that WikiLeaks ever got significant press play in the United States was in February of 2007. It had been founded in 2006, as far as we know. But in February of 2007, Cass Sunstein wrote an op-ed here in the Washington Post entitled Brave New Wiki World. And the Wiki World he's talking about is this new wonderful organization. And he says there's now a great new WikiLeaks organization which is going to target China. Interesting. Meaning that they're going to get embarrassing documents that will freak out the Beijing Politburo and make them lose face and bring on a color revolution in China. Now, obviously, as time goes on, they can be redirected. And if you look at the original WikiLeaks board, it's largely this group of very, very fishy Chinese so-called pro-democracy activists. Right. A lot of them with links to the Soros groups of
that's true.
Of foundations. So Cass Sunstein is the guy who, he's present at the creation. He's like the midwife of WikiLeaks. Now, Cass Sunstein also wrote another article the following year, and it gets back to our original 9/11 issue. Cass Sunstein says, we have these movements of opinion in the Western world, which are, of course, paranoid and oriented towards conspiracies. And we've got to fight these groups, right, the paranoid conspiracy groups. And he says what we need to do is to undertake the cognitive infiltration of those movements. Now, I would submit to you, WikiLeaks is the realization of Cass Sunstein's policy of having the cognitive infiltration really on a broader scale of the so-called youth bulge around the world.
Where does Assange fit into the plan?
Well, Assange. Now, what you seem to have here
seems to be a rebel, but I'm not sure.
Well, let's look at where he comes from. You can make a pretty good case that his pedigree is MK Ultra from the very beginning. That is, he's sort of a son of the CIA MK Ultra apparatus, or in this case, the CIA MI6 Australian apparatus. He comes from Melbourne, Australia, and the story is, you can find this, on Wikipedia, that his mother was for a time married to a man, and both of them, but especially the stepfather, were part of a cult in the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia. And this is the cult of a certain Anne Hamilton Byrne. And the method of the cult was that young children were brought into the cult. They were immediately dyed blonde. They were, hydrogen peroxide. You look at Assange. Huh. Sometimes he's a blonde. Sometimes he's a brunette. What does this mean? This seems to go back to this experience with the Anne Hamilton Byrne cult. But the main thing they did was everybody got their name changed to Hamilton Byrne. This was done with the complicity of local officials, because, of course, this was MK Ultra. It was sanctioned by the intelligence agencies. What happened to these poor kids is a story of really monstrous child abuse. They were given LSD, and they were given, I don't have the specific, formulary, but they were given about 8 to 10 different kinds of really heavy-duty psychopharmaca. And
all of them?
Yeah, all of them. I mean, and then it was things like, you can read it on Wikipedia, again, if they haven't taken it down. The Wikipedia says they were given LSD, and they were told to go into a dark room, and then after a while, Anne Hamilton Byrne would come to them. So you could imagine they were hallucinating and having nightmares and God knows what. This is what happened. So you look at Assange and you say, this guy, instead of getting cookies and milk, was getting an LSD cocktail from Anne Hamilton Byrne. That's the supposition. And you can look on the Internet, you can find pictures that purport to be the blonde, young Assange standing with, 6 or 8 or 10 other poor little kids who have been dyed blonde, and this is the Anne Hamilton Byrne cult. So you look at Assange. Certainly, he is someone who is deeply impaired emotionally. At least that's the impression I would have, that he's frozen. He talks in an emotionless monotone. He's
almost like a alien hybrid.
Yeah,
he's like he's genetically
very, very
altered or something. He's almost like a robot.
And then, of course, there was probably an aspect of what can we call them, flesh piles of some kind or other among these children. So that might then cast light on the charges that were made in Sweden. I don't know one way or another. But this is a very, very strange person. Now, politically, what does he say? He says he hates 9/11 Truth. He says 9/11 Truth is annoying. Oh, it's annoying. Why is it annoying? He says, I come with real scandals, and people, real revelations, and people are always chasing after this 9/11 nonsense. What's the point of this? Now, he wants to be a great, unmasker of the power structure, but the principal covert op of the age, he doesn't want to know about.
Yeah, or even question.
Yeah, he just says this is off the table. I mean, you can look at some of his competition, right? There's a thing called Cryptome by John Young, I think his name is. Now, there's somebody who seems to be rather more authentic. I mean, according to some reports, John Young left the Wikileaks board saying, this is an intelligence front. The Cryptome seems to be more interested in things like 9/11 Truth, but you'd think that out of all these documents, something would come out about 9/11. Now, let's just look at what's in the documents. Remember, when you start something like WikiLeaks, you got to provide some bait. You got to put out some chum at the beginning. So the first one is these very, very dramatic pictures of a U.S. atrocity in Iraq, right? These people being machine gunned from the air.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, it's very graphic. It's shocking. It's highly effective. On the other hand, the incident was known, the deaths were known, this was all known. The U.S. atrocities in Iraq are known. Then there's a second wave, which is all about how bad Maliki is. Again, the pro-Iranian guy who has managed to get himself as prime minister of Iraq and managed to stay there, resisting the attempts of the U.S.-backed Alawi to take over. So in a sense, you'd say, well, an attack on Maliki is a favor to the CIA. And so in the second round, they seem to be radical. They seem to be attacking the U.S. war effort in Iraq, but in reality, they're attacking the guy the U.S. wants to get rid of. I have to go back now, but my professional expertise here as a historian, right, my PhD dissertation and all this, is with a guy called Paolo Sarpi, S-A-R-P-I. He is the head of Venetian intelligence, the Venetian Republic, back in 1610, 1615, 1620, thereabouts. And Sarpi has a memorandum for the Venetian Senate and the Council of Ten, where he says the art of political manipulation consists in saying something good about somebody while pretending to say something bad, or doing something good for somebody while pretending to be attacking them. So this is what WikiLeaks does. It pretends to attack the U.S., but in reality, the people who get slammed are others. Now, the third document that makes this even more obvious. Who gets hit? Gaddafi gets hit with his Ukrainian nurse, right? The woman that's always around him. So, that's no skin off Washington's nose, right? Sarkozy gets hit. All right, fine. So
hold on, Webster. We're going to be right back with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Webster Tarpley, our special guest. His book, Surviving the Cataclysm, Your Guide Through the Worst Financial Crisis in Human History. We'll talk about that later on, too. And welcome back to Coast. Now, let's get back into Julian Assange and this incredible cult he was in, Webster. So as this little boy, he's in it, he grows up. Is he still friends with people?
I think he's been asked about this, and he says he can't remember. Now, who knows what that means? But again, look at this blonde hair. Why is he blonde sometimes and sometimes a brunette? Remembering that blondness... And it's blondness also because it has some kind of an Aryan, crazy race theory working there. Hard to say what it is. Anyway, Anne Hamilton Byrne was a real wild person. But again, these are the sorts of people that you find in sort of these MK Ultra settings. So you could say this is now the second generation of something, and he's put up there to be an ego ideal for these couple of 100 million nihilists, as I would say, across the world. And what's he purveying? He says 9/11 truth is worth nothing. I've got the real scandals. Well, what are his scandals? These essentially gossip points about Gaddafi, about Sarkozy. I was in Germany last week and talked about these themes, and some Germans said, we saw the stuff WikiLeaks had about Merkel, and it didn't add up to anything. It was weak. It was practically not there. Naturally, there's a lot of stuff about Putin, how bad Putin is, how he's a dictator, a villain, all this stuff. Berlusconi, of course, a mafia state. And then Ben Ali, right? And Ben Ali is the guy in Tunisia. He's guilty of a lavish lifestyle. So what they get out of this is the detonator of this entire series of color revolutions. And I was in Tunisia in 2004. Ben Ali, this is not really a dictatorship. This was sort of an authoritarian regime. I was there to talk to a professor. It was a philosophy congress. And I asked the professor, what do you think? Is Ben Ali a dictator? And he said, no, because the institutions of Tunisia limit the extent of Ben Ali's authoritarianism. So this was not maybe as bad as portrayed. Another person who got slammed in WikiLeaks is the president of Argentina, the widow of Kirchner, right? I think her name is Hernandez de Kirchner, who is obviously a target, right? Any third world leader with financial problems. So you look at all this and you say, well, there's nothing in here against the Israelis. There's nothing against the British. There's nothing against anybody in the U.S. government. Has any official been forced to resign? Have any programs or operations been exposed? Not a one.
Not one.
And you could say, well, 9/11 could have been exposed, right? There could have been stuff about the Israeli invasion of Gaza, right? That when they ran amok there for a couple of months, or other things, right? There are all kinds of operations that might have been exposed. So it looks like what Assange is peddling are some things that are very, very carefully selected, sanitized, and they may even be fake. In other words, who guarantees us that this stuff is all...
But why his legal issues, or is that a front?
Well, he has to be a martyr. In other words, he's got to be persecuted in order to make the whole thing look serious, right? And people have a deep need to see him persecuted. I mean, that was always, with Obama, right? The idea was that somebody, one might, make a move against Obama, and therefore all the left liberals had to be so concerned. Let me also go back, because I think this is the second edition of an operation. The obvious parallel is the Pentagon Papers, and it's obvious because Daniel Ellsberg, right, the great Pentagon Papers hero,
had him on the show a long time ago.
Well, he says that Julian Assange is his reincarnation, and Assange indeed says, yes, I'm the reincarnation of Daniel Ellsberg. Right. What does that mean? Now, what are the Pentagon Papers? It's very, very similar. The Pentagon Papers are essentially a kind of history of the Vietnam War that was put together in the late 60s by Leslie Gelb and Morton Halperin. And they created these Pentagon Papers, and somehow the Pentagon Papers got from their hands into the hands of Daniel Ellsberg, who at that time was very much pro-war. He was somebody who had been in Vietnam. He had been associated with General Ed Lansdale, right, the original ugly American, and he apparently had taken part in combat and with some gusto, from what I can read. So the papers get from Leslie Gelb and Morton Halperin to the guy who's going to give them out, right, to Daniel Ellsberg. Now, what happens to Leslie Gelb and Morton Halperin after this is done? Well, Leslie Gelb goes on to become the president of the New York Council on Foreign Relations. Need I say more? And Morton Halperin becomes the political manager of the entire Soros group of foundations, where he, I believe, continues to this very day. So they didn't lose their careers. And now, what's in the Pentagon Papers, which is presented in such bombastic stuff? Namely, nothing new. And if you had been reading Le Monde of France or any of the Italian papers, any European paper really, you would know everything in the Pentagon Papers and more. And I guess I could say this because I was doing this, and I did. And when I saw the Pentagon Papers, I said, what is the big deal? We know all this. Then, however, you look more deeply. You say, what's the general thrust of the Pentagon Papers? Well, one thing is, the CIA gets a complete whitewash. The CIA is practically not mentioned. They're not bad. Who's bad? The U.S. Army is very bad, and indeed they may have done some terrible things, but you can see the direction. And now, who is the individual villain of the Vietnam War? It's President John F. Kennedy. And this, of course, is absolutely coherent with the hatred of Kennedy that was so widespread in the CIA after the Bay of Pigs, and when Kennedy fired Allen Dulles and the entire.
Well, and Kennedy was easing us out of there, wasn't he?
Yes, and that's the other thing. You'd say if the Pentagon Papers were really hot stuff, they would have something on the principal covert op of that era, i.e. the Kennedy assassination. And it's amazing to see in the Pentagon Papers how they just paper over. They say, well, there was a new president, or they don't. There's nothing about Kennedy assassination, right? John F. Kennedy shot. Nothing like this. It just says this was discussed in October 1963 with the president, and then again in December 1963 with the successor, right, with the new president. So nothing about the Kennedy assassination. So you see that what we've got, it seems to me, is a re-edition of the Pentagon Papers, and there have been other cases like this. You may remember the so-called Lockheed scandal of 1975-76, which brought down the governments of Italy, of Japan. It ended the political career of Prince Bernhard of Holland. It basically watergated the entire sort of Cold War institutions around the world. The CIA is always concerned with...
It was a bribery scandal, wasn't it?
Yeah, bribery. It was supposedly making Lockheed look bad because the Lockheed was bribing all these foreign officials, but the damage done was to the foreign officials who were named. So it's always a scandal that purports to be one thing. In other words, it purports to be saying something bad about the U.S., but it's really saying something much worse about others. So I think this is pretty much the model, and it's interesting that Morton Halperin, who was there then, is still in the in this prominent position in the Soros foundations now today. And there was some idea that the original Wiki board was people who had somehow some kind of ties, direct or indirect, with the Soros foundation group. So it seems to me that this is a left cover covert operation. And again, it's a limited hangout. It's a self-exposure. You can call it a striptease because it involves showing certain parts and then hiding other parts and attempting to excite attention by this kind of a charade. It's very unfortunate. Certainly left liberals thought that Obama was their hero and their savior and their messiah. And in December of last year, right when Obama caved on the Bush tax cuts, a lot of them became very, very disenchanted. And lo and behold, Assange is there as a more radical alternative. In other words, a new hero, a new, even more out of the mainstream.
Is he also the whipping boy?
Well, I think he is certainly in danger. In other words, he might at a certain point the calculation might be that he's more valuable as a martyr, and therefore I hope that this doesn't happen. But this is certainly the danger. Maybe there's one other thing. My own personal rivalry, maybe with Assange, clash with Assange, you might say, went a little bit like this. In October of 2009, I went to Reykjavik, Iceland, and I gave a series of 5 lectures in Reykjavik. And this is a time now when Iceland is under tremendous attack by the British and the Dutch. And the British and the Dutch say to them, guess what? You had banks that took deposits in our countries. Your bank went bankrupt, right, this ICE save, and you owe us $12 billion with a B. So it's a country of about 300,000 people.
They don't have the money.
It's impossible. It's out of this world. It's a lunatic exercise. So the obvious thing for Iceland to say is, no, we will not pay. We are declaring a unilateral debt moratorium, an open-ended freeze on all payments of interest and principal. Because this is not even real debt. In other words, there never was a contract where Iceland said, we will pay. These are not even debts that were contracted. It's pure extortion, right? Pure blackmail. And essentially what I found in giving these lectures was that there was already a pretty good body of opinion in Iceland that the debt moratorium was really the key to national survival, right, for the whole country. And it's a fascinating civilization. Right? It goes back 1,000 years or more to the Vikings and all the rest of this. Then Assange blows into town. I leave, Assange comes in, and Assange's argument, or he's been there, right, he comes and goes. Who knows how he pays for it. He blows into town and says, that's not radical. Let's do my shtick, which is these documents here. This is radical. And some of the very valuable, very good people that had been interested in the national salvation through a debt moratorium were then, I think, diverted into Assange's crazy activity.
Were people listening to him? I mean, did he have that kind of clout?
To him, yeah, because one of the things he did was he would come with leaked documents about the
about whatever.
The debate, specifically what interested them at the time. In other words, he'd say, "Oh, you're interested because the British and the Dutch are demanding money from you. Here, I have some documents. I have a London cabinet document. I have something from the Dutch, central bank or whatever it is, and it shows how they're plotting,
to get you
the money.
So they love that.
He's got to start with real bait.
Yeah,
there've got to be authentic, highly interesting elements at the beginning.
So he could get his foot in the door.
So then he gets his foot in the door, and then he leads you into the desert, right? Because some of the people have come under legal attack now, because they were involved with Assange, whereas they could have been doing something, I think, much more to the point, which would be save your country, don't worry. And the other thing about Assange is he does not say that the Iraq war should end. He does not say that the Afghan war should end. He just says whatever you do should be transparent. What does that mean? Transparency, of course, a great CIA slogan, right? It's a way to attack governments all around the world. It's a great, all-purpose tool to destabilize anybody because governments are secretive. This doesn't change. People are secretive, right? Privacy is secretive. So he's against hierarchy, and he's in favor of transparency. The anti-hierarchy part is essentially the eternal Oedipal rebellion of the youth, right? The rejection of the father, right? That Mubarak is bad because he's old and he's discredited, and the young people know what to do. If you look at Europe in the 1920s and 30s, the idea that the youth know what to do, very dangerous idea in Germany and Italy in those years.